Greetings to one and all. On behalf of the conference team, I welcome the chief guest, keynote speakers, chairpersons, panelists, resource persons of the workshops, anchors, members of the academic advisory committee, organizing team, and all the participants and delegates who have come to participate in this 3-day international conference on hybrid, blended, and e-learning, ICHBL 2021, jointly organized by Educational Technology Management Association, Association of Indian Universities, and Gurugram Progressive Schools Council. Welcome, one and all. Welcome. Let's begin the conference. Over to you, Dr. Renu Nanda. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rama. Namaskar. Good morning. We will begin the session today with the traditional lighting of the lamp. Please call and get rid of this. To welcome Professor Asha Kanwar, the keynote speaker, we present a virtual bouquet to her. Thank you. To welcome Professor Tony Bates, the chairperson of the first session, we present a virtual bouquet to him. Professor Tony Bates is requested to chair the session.
Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Kanwar. Many of you will know her as well or better than I do, but I've had the privilege of working with her many times. She is currently President and CEO of the Commonwealth of Learning, but more importantly, I think, she's a world-leading advocate for learning for sustainable development. She has a very distinguished past, which includes being the Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the Indira Gandhi National Open University, and also she was a Fulbright Scholar at the Iowa State University. She is a leading scholar and leader in open distance education, has 8 honorary doctorates, but above all, she's a gracious and wonderful person. So I'm looking forward to her presentation. I hand it back to you for the video.
Distinguished colleagues, let me begin by thanking Professor Mukhopadhyay for the invitation to join you today. My topic is sustainable education, hybrid, blended, or e-learning. This aligns well with the mission and mandate of my organization, the Commonwealth of Learning. COL helps Commonwealth member states and institutions to use distance learning and technologies for expanding access to education and training. In this presentation, I will begin by outlining some of the key issues of our times in education. I will then look at what we mean by hybrid, blended, and e-learning, followed by a discussion of how technologies can support sustainable education. Finally, I will conclude with some lessons that we can draw from the pandemic to build sustainable education that leaves no one behind. So let us first look at 3 key issues that impact education in both developed and developing countries. The global community has committed to achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4 and has been battling the pandemic over the past 2 years and dealing with climate-related disasters. SDG 4 aspires to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning for all by 2030. Even before the pandemic, it was clear that the global community was far from achieving the targets it had set for itself in providing access to primary, secondary, and tertiary education. If we are to achieve SDG 4 by 2030, we need to move beyond the business as usual approach and the brick and mortar mindset, which assumes that learning is only possible within the walls of a classroom. During the pandemic, we found the greatest challenge related to digital infrastructure, lack of access to devices, connectivity, even electricity. Teachers were not prepared for the sudden transition to online learning. Existing inequalities were further exacerbated. And in a survey conducted at the University of Hyderabad, indicated that while close to 90% of all students had a mobile phone, only about 37% could access online classes. The barriers included unreliable connectivity, high costs of data connection, and unreliable power supply. Now, teachers are central to our mission, and over 63 million teachers were impacted by COVID-19. Data from OECD countries indicates that only 60% of teachers had some training in ICTs. The vulnerable are most impacted in crisis situations. It is estimated that the numbers of school dropouts will increase, with 11 million girls not likely to return. The climate crisis is one of the defining issues of our times, especially for the Commonwealth, with its 32 small states, which are disproportionately affected by climate change. The education sector, from primary to tertiary, contributes to both direct and indirect emissions, with an impact on environmental degradation and associated economic costs. If we look strictly at contributions to emissions, the achievement of SDG 4, while it will be a good thing, but under the current paradigm, could potentially worsen the climate crisis. Can hybrid, blended, and e-learning help us to address these major challenges? At CALL, we use e-learning as an umbrella term to refer to the use of any digital device or multimedia for teaching and learning. E-learning can take place without any reference to a network or connectivity. The digital device used by the learner need not be connected to a digital network. The connection can be to a local area network or the internet. Blended learning is a combination of online and face-to-face interactions. Some examples of blended learning are the flipped classroom, online interactions followed by face-to-face teaching, or in-person practicals. Some examples of blended learning are the flipped classroom, online interactions followed by face-to-face teaching, or in-person practicals. Hybrid learning is often used interchangeably with blended learning, primarily in the US, and was used much more frequently during the pandemic. But at a more granular level, hybrid learning is a combination of online and in-person teaching and learning at a program level, where different courses could be offered in either face-to-face or online or blended mode, creating a multimodal approach to teaching and learning. Blended and hybrid modes provide opportunities for learning to those who cannot access purely online provision. Open and Distance Learning, or ODL, has always adopted a blended approach, keeping in mind issues of social justice. The UGC in India has issued a concept note on blended learning in May this year, seeking inputs from a wide variety of stakeholders. And research shows that blended learning is sometimes more effective in developing countries. It is also more cost-effective, as data from open universities shows. A study for teacher training found that while face-to-face costs per participant in a teacher training course were about $6.7 US, the same training was offered online at half the costs with comparable outcomes. A recent call study on the social return on investment showed that every dollar invested in open schools resulted in returns of $4 to $5 of benefits for the students, and also led to the improved performance of teachers. Again, research shows us that there is no significant difference between distance and traditional classroom instruction in terms of learning outcomes. Yet, there is a lingering perception that distance education is not as effective as class-based education. In fact, the research also shows that students in blended learning performed marginally better than those who were going only to the classroom. Now, one silver lining at this time has been the global acceptance of distance and online learning. A recent study in the UK found that the majority of higher education students rated the quality of online learning as excellent. So what implications does this have for promoting sustainable education? Let us first look at how CALL uses distance learning and technologies to promote learning for sustainable development. CALL believes that learning must lead to sustainable development, which means that learning must contribute to economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental conservation. Let me share examples of how we do this. One example of economic growth was the CALL Coursera Workforce Recovery Collaboration, where over 150,000 Commonwealth citizens were offered free skilling and reskilling opportunities from some of the top universities in the world. Even though connectivity was often a challenge, learners used mobile devices or library facilities in what has been a life-changing experience for thousands. We know that a large percentage of those graduating from the educational system lack the skills for employment. During this time, CALL supported universities to integrate employment pathways into their systems. Now let's come to social inclusion. CALL uses affordable and accessible technologies to reach the bottom billion. Open educational resources are another solution to improving the quality and reducing the costs of education. In partnership with the OER Foundation at the Otago Polytechnic in New Zealand, CALL launched the OER for COVID, which attracted participants from 89 countries. The survey conducted found that participants did not simply want access to repositories or general capacity building, but rather sought urgent help with curated content aligned to their specific curriculum. For low bandwidth contexts, CALL responded by developing a video-on-demand service using OER in STEM subjects aligned to the curriculum in Fiji, Nauru, and Samoa. Finally, as part of its environmental conservation agenda, CALL supported the development of a green teacher program in Nigeria, which helps teachers inculcate environmental concerns among learners from a very early stage. CALL also offered MOOCs on business for sustainable development and on the blue economy with universities in Mauritius and Seychelles. In the past 3 decades, several initiatives have emerged to promote sustainability in higher education. As Caird and Roy sum up, these relate to greening the curriculum, greening the campus, and using distance and online learning. Let us look at examples of each. Several universities, including the Australian National University and Groningen, have strategies in place to green the campus and reduce emissions through adopting renewable energy and promoting resource conservation. Adopting distance and online learning can promote environmental sustainability. And the evidence is that the SUSTEACH project, supported by the Open University UK, compared the carbon emissions of ICT-enhanced and face-to-face courses and found that distance teaching models had significantly lower environmental impacts. CALL also conducted a similar study in Botswana and found that the average learning-related carbon footprint of the face-to-face group was 3 times higher than that of the distance learning students. So, what have we learned from these different initiatives in promoting sustainable education? One, that sustainability agenda has to move from pilot phase to become mainstream. 2, in countries where resources and incentives were provided, this agenda was more successful. For example, in the US, partnerships and platforms have been effective in helping advocacy efforts and sharing best practice. For these initiatives to achieve scale, we need committed leadership at management, student, and community levels. So these are concrete examples of what worked in different contexts. How can such interventions be integrated into sustainable education? First, we have seen that purely online options do not work for everyone. The future will be a blend of online and in-person approaches using a range of technologies that are affordable, accessible, and available. Because of the existing digital divide, technology to be effective must be placed in an appropriate social, cultural, and political context. Second, as the climate crisis assumes greater urgency than ever before, we need to integrate key sustainability concepts into the curriculum. This would mean adopting a green learning agenda, and this agenda would focus on developing the skills for green jobs that will help make the transition to a low carbon economy, green life skills for a more sustainable future, and skills for a green transformation that addresses issues of social justice. Third, we need to build the capacity of teachers by providing just-in-time and on-site training in technology integration for teaching and learning, and in addressing the key issues of our times. Fourth, in order to address the growing inequalities, governments and institutions need to develop policies that address the needs of the last person in the queue. And these are often women, girls, those in remote regions, and persons with disabilities. The policies that target the margins are also more effective in serving the needs of the center. So to sum up, what is sustainable education? It is education that is affordable and accessible for all. Institutions need to align more closely with the needs of their societies and promote research that leads to sustainable development. And finally, learning must result in modeling sustainable behaviors that lead to the prosperity of the people and the planet. So on that note, let me wish the conference every success and thank you for your attention.
And now Professor Tony Bates is requested to comment and to also give his views specifically on the address of the keynote speaker, Professor Asha Kanwar. Over to Professor Tony Bates, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Kanwar, for a very clear and thoughtful presentation. I was really interested to see the link she made between blended learning and sustainable development. I think there are some major challenges in sustainable development, whether we use blended learning or not. But I think we need to get away from the argument about whether online or in-person teaching is best. We need both. But what we need to do is know how to use them together in an integrated way, and when to use in-person and when to use online learning. Now, this means focusing on what each does best. And one thing we've learned, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, is that different students have very different needs. Some students don't have access to the internet or don't have the equipment at home. Now, if online access is a key for sustainable development, this will mean providing online access at or through the university, college, or school. So students should have an opportunity to either access online at home, or if they can't, to access it at school or college or university. And if that's the case, we need to rethink the way we design our schools, our campuses, and our classrooms. We need to have our classrooms wired up. We need students to be able to demonstrate their online work on screens in class and have that discussed, for instance, or get feedback from the instructor. So we need to integrate the technology with our classrooms. We also need, for particularly students who don't have good internet access at home, individual study carrels where they can go online or borrow equipment. And libraries too can play a very important role here. And also the use of community centers that have internet access that students could go to. So partnership here is very important with other providers of access to online learning. And I think it's also important to remember that because of the way that jobs are changing so rapidly, lifelong learning is becoming increasingly important. People need to go back and study something different because they need new knowledge and new skills for the different jobs that are happening. And for these learners, fully online learning is likely to be more appropriate because it's much more flexible. They're working, they probably got some money coming in, so they probably got internet access already. And these are very different from, say, children going to school who don't have that access at home. The other thing that lifelong learning requires are alternative credentials. They don't want to come back and do another degree. They may already have done a degree. What they want is a credential that recognizes the new learning that they've done, which may be quite short. It may be only a week or two, but it may be a competency or skill that they require, and they need to have some way of having that skill or their knowledge of that skill recognized. And that means developing credentials that are widely recognized between institutions and between institutions and employers. And Professor Kanwar very rightly emphasized the importance of open educational resources. These are resources that are free and online, and anybody can use them. They have a particular kind of license that stops them being commercialized. And what it means is that you can access these open education resources from anywhere in the world. MOOCs are a very good example, but there are also a lot more simpler resources. In my province in British Columbia, every first and second year university and college course now has an open textbook or open textbooks. So students don't pay for textbooks anymore. They can download them for free. And if you have basic courses like introductory chemistry, you only need one textbook for that. So it makes a lot of sense to make those open and easily accessible. But also you can make videos of experiments or show processes such as stripping a car engine down, or you can use it for teaching languages. But there's a language issue here. At the moment, most of these open education resources are in English, and they've been developed in advanced countries and reflect often the culture and the interests of those advanced countries. What's really needed are national or regional programs to create local open education resources, particularly for the basic or common subjects that are taught throughout a province. So in summary, I fully agree with Professor Kanwar's point. The world is now digital. We can't escape it anywhere in the world now. We need to use digital learning to prepare our students and our learners for the future. And what we need to learn, and we're still working this out, is the best way to blend the digital learning with in-person learning, so we get the best of both. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tony Bates. In the meantime, I have a few queries, sir. I would be addressing those, asking you those, but the participants are requested to comment either in the chat box, or you can raise your hands, or you can just kind of unmute yourself, give your suggestions and comments for either Professor Asha Kanwar or Professor Tony Bates. Sir, I wanted to ask you, because Professor Asha Kanwar's presentation certainly was very interesting and very motivating and inspiring, specifically, in a country like India. See, my concern is when you talk about the Sustainable Development Goal 4, then how can we look at this goal without worsening the climate degradation? Please suggest something.
One of the things that's going to happen is that if we do digitalize our classrooms, if we do make our classrooms more accessible, students will often not have to come into the campus so often. They may come in specifically for activities, but do a lot of their other work online at home. At University of British Columbia, they found that the online distance students reduced the number of cars coming on campus by about 20 to 25%. There are lots of ways in which the technology can actually cut down on greenhouse emissions. Now, there's the other side of that. You need servers, and you need equipment that generates or requires electricity and so on, and that can be a problem. But certainly the more we green our energy supplies, the greener digital and online learning will become as well. So I think there are many ways in which digital learning can help with climate change. It won't do it on its own, but if you add up all the students all around the world that get on a bus and come to campus, and if they don't have to do that, that's a huge difference. We have something like 1/3 of students in North America now taking online courses. So for every one of those students, that's a saved bus journey or a car journey.
Professor Bates, there is a question in the chat box. What is the key difference between hybrid learning and blended learning in classroom practices? Well,
blended learning is evolving very rapidly, and the two terms are often used interchangeably. I think Americans tend to use hybrid a bit more than blended. Some would argue that there is a special kind of blended learning, like where it's integrated so that you've chosen deliberately to do some things face-to-face and some things online, whereas blended might be doing both, have the students face-to-face and have them online. So I don't think there are clear definitions yet for blended and hybrid, and that's because we're working out different ways of doing it. And eventually we'll learn, but we don't have clear definitions now. I think we can say, yes, it's fully online. That's where students don't come on campus at all. And it's fully in person where they don't use the computer. But then there's everything in between. And I think most things are going to be in between. So that covers all kinds of teaching. So I think it's going to be very hard to have a definition of blended learning, at least for the next few years.
Well, if I can pitch in here, if you go to the literature, blended learning is not one single thing. There are 8 models already identified. Cleveland and Innes, they worked for Commonwealth of Learning from Athabasca. They have also given 2 broad models. One is very comprehensive. And as Professor Tony Bates pointed out, there's a continuum between human beings. It's a continuum, and blended learning lies in between this whole continuum with changing proportion of in-person. As in-person reduces, as technology increases, in-person reduces. So it is very difficult to, really speaking, we haven't come across yet a completely acceptable definition of blended learning. Flipped learning, blended learning, hybrid learning, e-learning, all questions are learning. So I think Professor Tony has made very interesting, but those who have interested may like to look at the guidelines for blended learning. It was written in 2018 by Cleveland Innes and Dan Wilton, if I remember correctly the name.
Yes, we do a national survey of all our universities in Canada to see how many students are teaching on, how many students are studying online. And it's been difficult but possible to measure how many are fully online. But we have a clear definition which we give to the institutions so they know what they're counting. We've tried to do that with blended learning. We've tried so many different definitions drawn from the literature. And every time we do that, somebody comes up with another way of doing blended learning that we hadn't anticipated. So I think the other problem is that the registry knows if students aren't coming on campus or if they're coming into class because they have to schedule a classroom. But for blended learning, that's an instructor's choice. The instructor may be allocated 3 classrooms a week, but may only use it once a week with the students doing the rest online. So again, it's very hard to track blended learning.
What digital and pedagogical skills are required by the teachers for effective use of hybrid and blended learning?
Yeah, that's a very good question. A minimum of 12 hours study time. We've tried to provide the essentials for blended and online learning. Several institutions have done this across North America. University of Central Florida requires all their faculty to take a 12-hour introductory session on blended and teaching in a blended or fully distanced way. It's not rocket science, but there are things that you need to know. In particular, you have to be aware that students are often studying in isolation if they're studying online, and therefore you need to keep them active and engaged. And there are lots of easy ways to do that, but you have to build it into your teaching deliberately and not assume it will happen.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question from Farzana. How e-learning can help young students of the pre-primary level?
Yeah, now I have mixed feelings about online learning in the school sector. I think it's fine certainly for students who are in senior high school. They can handle certainly online learning if they're introduced to it properly. Probably not doing all their studies online, but doing some of them. And a lot of 15, 16, 17-year-olds like that because it gives them more freedom. They can study whenever they want. They can stay up late and do the work and do their work and so lie in bed in the morning if they don't have to go back into school. So it suits some students. Other students, school students hate it. And the younger the student, the less appropriate it becomes, because school provides so much more than just instruction for many younger children. They learn how to behave socially with other young children. They learn how to be outside the family, etc. So those are very important interpersonal skills that they need to be in school for. So I don't ever see online learning replacing schools, particularly for younger children.
To comment on the e-manipulatives that are being now used in the pre-primary education, I mean, same Montessori and kindergarten kind of things, instead of, hands-on. Now, there are a lot of e-manipulatives which can be used for e-learning in the pre-primary level.
Yeah, so I'm not
What's
saying
your view on that?
I'm not saying it has no use. I'm just saying it has less use the younger the child gets. I mean, I think it's very good that students quite young should learn how to use an iPad for educational purposes, for instance.
Yeah.
I think that's very useful, but you're not replacing the classroom teacher as you might be with the older child.
Yeah, connected to that, sir, there's a question from R. Bakshi that what about the social interaction, that the educational institutions provide? How can we think of replacing them?
Well, it depends what kind of social interaction you're talking about. Let me give you an extreme case. This is a student who's graduated from university, has been on campus for 4 years, maybe 7 years, done a PhD, but now is changing their job. And they need to connect with other people who have similar knowledge and skills. So you can set up a community of practice online for people like that, so they can share experiences within their professional field. So if you're talking about academic knowledge, it's not difficult. In fact, it's sometimes easier to create social networks online. If you're talking about things like, for instance, teaching a language and understanding a culture around that language, that's probably a bit more difficult to do online. You probably need to have students immersed in that culture, for instance. So, for instance, many Indian students come to Canada. It's not just learning engineering. They're trying to learn about the culture and the language and so on, and that's very important for them. So, and that is hard to replace at a distance. And we've had lots of international students complain they've been able to do their courses online, but they're missing out on all those cultural aspects. So again, it's been very, what's the word I want? It's been very selective about how you use these tools so that you use them appropriately in the right context. One of the problems is you can't sort of set general rules, because in education, the context is absolutely critical, and the context varies so much from different programs, different schools, different countries, and so on. So you've got to allow for that cultural influence.
Arnav is asking, isn't it that e-learning and environment sustainability are contradictory to each other, because we need more e-equipment here, which could be environmentally, it could be hazardous to the environment?
Yeah, so I don't think online learning is set up to solve the climate issue. The climate issue is far broader. I think it can make a minor contribution, and we want every contribution we can to this climate crisis. In my own province, we're having terrible climate events. We've had the hottest day ever recorded in Canada this summer. We've had wildfires. We've had floods this last week. So we're feeling the impact of climate change. And I think online learning can help a little bit, but it's not, the issues that are causing climate change are much broader than that. We have to deal with things like the use of coal, the use of gas and oil and so on, because they create much more than anything that online learning could possibly save, although it can help.
And also, sir, that like Chanchal is asking that how much it is cost effective when we talk about blended learning, and like you were talking about the green campus, isn't it very expensive, sir?
Well, it's no more expensive than building new buildings. It's actually cheaper than building a new building because you've probably got most of the infrastructure in place, the water, the electricity. So one of the things I think we really need to look at is our building programs. Do we really want to add more new buildings, or should we not be looking at the buildings we've got and making them more appropriate, especially as probably students aren't going to come on campus as much if they can do stuff online. So you have a choice there of, unfortunately, politicians, and I have to say, university chancellors like to open new buildings. They like to invite the business community in and so on. So, you know, it's probably more sexy than changing what you've already got. But I think we really need to think about our capital investments in the future if we're going digital.
What I could understand from the questions raised by Renu through and other people is, one, when we have this blended learning, what is the thin line which should demarcate between the physical learning and the e-learning? Because the question on socialization which was asked probably was, like in the universities or the educational institutions, we tend to make a balance between the academics, sports, cultural events, and other activities. That is what is all-round development of a student. But in this blended learning, there is a tendency which we are observing that people are going more and more towards online learning. And less to physical learning. Isn't that detrimental? And where is that thin line of demarcation? What is the percentage of blended and the physical learning which one should have to strike a balance and to have the optimum advantage from the educational institutions?
I think students vary a great deal about how much they need the social side and how much they don't. You know, students are very different. In Canada, students who are 17 or 18 coming out of high school, they want to go to university because they want that social, cultural, and sporting and partying and so on. When they get to third or fourth year, you know, they've been through that and they want to get out of the university as quickly as they can. So they much more liable to take online courses as they get into third and fourth year than they would in first and second year. And secondly, online learning needs a fair degree of self-discipline. It's a skill that you can be taught, you can learn it. And blended learning is a very good bridge between students coming into the first year who may not have any online learning skills to when they leave and go into the workforce and need to study fully online. Blended learning can be a bridge between those two realities. So it's not a question of either or, it's designing the teaching so it fits the needs of specific students. And there's not one answer to that, there's multiple answers. And the mix of online, blended, and face-to-face should change as students progress through the university, with more online learning towards the end and less at the beginning. And that could be a curriculum choice, for instance.
I think there are a couple of things which possibly are the missing links. We need to understand when you're talking of blended learning, flipped learning, e-learning, any of these, common denominator is learning. Now, the other issue is when you look at the 21st century paradigm, almost every country is talking about, recently finished a work for another country on behalf of COL. The target is to generate lifelong self-learners. And that is why Barry Zimmerman's work comes very handy. Now, when you talk of developing that one, lifelong self-learner and the 21st century learner wants to assert themselves. They want to decide what curriculum they will learn, how they will learn, how they will take the assessment. I think this elderly supervision or control of learning process of children or the young adults is a thing of past. The whole question is technology has opened up, for example, a difference of view, 6 billion or 6 powerful search engines. Internet penetration is increasingly deepening all over the world. And the handheld devices are becoming cheaper and more powerful. So learning is going to be under the control of the learner rather than by the teacher. The whole concept of changing the word from teaching to helping learning, if you look at from that kind of paradigm, then we'll be able to better appreciate blended learning is not necessarily just technology. Technology is one component of that one, but which kind of learning tactics adds to the achievement of higher order cognition. Now, given this new approach that we are looking at lifelong self-learner, if you look at Singapore document, British document, anywhere, today's learning design has to be helping children, helping students to learn, rather than dumping the knowledge. And this knowledge is today available, as I use in my there are two supermarkets. One is where you can buy. Go to Coursera, Future Learn, Udemy, edX, so on and so forth. There's another supermarket where learning material available free. That's the OER dimension. So the whole paradigm is changing. Our old way of looking at that, what is good for students, what is not good for students, has a very limited value for me. What is important is you guide them. For example, how to access resources through internet is more important than telling them here is the source. So I think we need to reconstruct blended learning. As I mentioned, there are 8 different models. And I would, in fact, myself ask Professor Tony Bates to reflect on the community of inquiry model, which is very popular nowadays, and that also mixes with our earlier concept of learning organization. So the community of inquiry model, in fact, these are the kind of new generation evolving, and we need to look at that. I'll stop at that, and if Professor Bates has any special observation on community of inquiry approach, I'll be very happy to.
Yes, I like the community of inquiry model. I use it myself when I teach. I'd like to think about social and cognitive presence, and I try to build that into my classes. I think the important thing here is that we've had probably about 20 years experience of fully online learning. We know what works and what doesn't. We have good theory to guide us. We have good research to guide us. Unfortunately, most instructors and teachers don't know about this. And so it comes back to an earlier question about training. And yes, it's easy to train somebody to use Zoom, but it's not so easy to get them to change their teaching method, which is going to be necessary if they're going to be effective using blended and hybrid learning. So there's a bigger issue here about changing teaching methods and understanding pedagogy, which many university professors don't, they're not specialists in it. There's no reason why they should know this until now. Now they do have to know it. And that's a big challenge for everybody. How are we going to help instructors who don't have this background? School teachers, we can build it into their basic training. But for university professors, most of them, their basic training is subject discipline and research as a PhD. They're not taught to teach. And it's going to be very hard to change universities unless we have a better way of preparing instructors for these changes.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. And I want to know that how can a teacher ensure involvement or participation of children with special needs, especially the hearing or the visually impaired?
Well, again, there are solutions. There is an approach to teaching called universal design, which takes account of the need to provide all kinds of teaching, not just online, in alternative formats for children who have visual impairment or have hearing difficulties and so on. And one of the great things about technology is that you can do that with the technology. You can have video, you can have audio, and students can choose which they prefer. So again, but you have to build that into the design of the course, and you have to do that at the start. It's much harder to retrofit a course to put these things in. If you start at the beginning and say, well, we're going to offer several different media in this course, so that immediately covers a lot of students with different physical abilities and so on. What's much more difficult is accommodating children with cognitive disabilities. And again, that's not a specific challenge to online or blended. It's the same challenge for classroom teachers as well. So I don't think there's a specific cure here for students with cognitive difficulties. They're probably going to need more tutor support, more individual help from an instructor than other students.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Ramesh is asking, Professor Ramesh, what research areas the teachers can explore for hybrid and blended learning? Please advise some themes as we are beginning our career, and such research will help us in understanding blended learning potential better.
Well, you've asked a very good question here because it's relatively new. It's been around for a while, but it's only been used in a few places. So we don't have much research in this area. It's an ideal area for students who are looking for a PhD, for instance. And there are two ways to do that. One is to look at what people are doing elsewhere in other universities, or probably the best way is to try blended learning yourself and self-monitor it and see how well it works and what the problems are, and publish that as a paper. So I think there's lots of opportunities for research here, but you don't have a lot to go on. You have to draw from research in other areas, such as research into fully online learning or research into classroom teaching. One of the interesting things is that people ask, what are the best practices in online? But when you get into blended, you also have to ask the question, what are the best practices in face-to-face teaching as well? And so, again, the quality issue comes up. Yes, we have a lot of quality standards for online learning. We have very few standards for quality in-person teaching. And I think that's going to be an interesting issue as well if we go to blended learning.
So Mona wants to know the perceived contribution to be made by the parents during this time of pandemic.
Yes, I feel very sorry for parents during the pandemic for all kinds of reasons. Many parents are working as well, working from home. They've got their kids at home. They're trying to balance out the pressures from the school. I think it's been very, very difficult. I think parents have had more problems than either the students or the instructors and teachers during the pandemic, because they've been put in a very difficult position. And certainly in my country, the school boards have handled the situation much more poorly in the school system than in the university system. They haven't told parents very clearly what their roles are, what their responsibilities are. They've asked too much of parents. And I think it could have been handled a lot better, certainly in my country.
Dr. Sneh Bansal wants to know about adopting to the online teaching is essential, keeping in view the change in situation. All of a sudden, evidences from research also suggested that teachers are more empowered and technology enabler. It's more of the skills rather than the knowledge of engaging the students online. So that's what she feels about the whole thing. That's her observation about it, sir. And there's a question, sir, from Rasika. How do you manage students who are unmotivated or off task with adaptation to e-learning?
Yes, well, that's a question of course design. It's not specific to online learning. The big difference is that you can't see the students so easily when they're online. You can tell if they're not motivated when they're in the class. So now you can monitor what students do through the learning management system. You can see whether they're participating or not. And one of the things that's become very clear from the very beginning of fully online learning is that you have to keep the students active. They have to have something to do every day. They have to get feedback on their activity, not necessarily a grade, but something, a response from an instructor or from other students. So, and again, you have to build a social community as well, so that they know the other students on their course. And again, that has to be built into the design of the course. Now, you can create a very good community online in an online course, but there are designs that you have to follow in order to make sure that happens. It doesn't happen by accident. A common thing that I do is I ask students with their permission, I get them, usually we have a website for the course, so students can create their own blogs, so they can create a blog just within that class. You know, that's, the software allows it to be restricted to the class, so the students can post a short bio, who they are, and so on. And I try to give at least the first week to get the students to introduce each other and talk to each other online, so they get to know one another. So, but you have to make a specific effort to do that. Otherwise, the students will remain isolated and they won't communicate with each other.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So, Dr. Mrityunjay wants to know what instructional design is most effective for hybrid and blended learning?
Good question. I don't think we know yet. I mean, we can apply what we know about what's good for in-person teaching, and we can apply what we know what's good for online. But I think we're still learning about how best to do blended learning. We may have different models. And again, the value of the model will depend on what kind of learning outcomes you're trying to get, how important social interaction is in your class. In some classes, it's more important than others. I think we have to do a lot more research on blended learning and evaluate what we're doing before we can come up with clear answers about good models for blended learning. I think the one principle I try to hang on to is I assume that anything can be taught just as well face-to-face or online, except, and it's the exceptions that we need to focus on. In other words, why should the student get on the bus to come into my class? What am I offering in my class that they couldn't get just as well online? And if I can't answer that question, why am I asking them to come in? Why don't I just put it all online? So we need to start asking about the affordances of face-to-face versus online, what each does best. And there's no one answer to that. It will depend on the subject area, it will depend on the students and so on. But that's one of the things we're going to have to learn as we go.
Dr. Sudesh wants to know, what is your opinion about the cost factor in favor of online learning that may create situations which are in-person learning opportunities may be limited and may impact the most disadvantaged?
Well, cost is a tricky issue because basically classroom costs go up in a very straight line if you keep the class size the same. So let's assume that you're talking about a class of 30 and you have one instructor for 30, then you have 120 students, you need 4 instructors. So your costs are going up 4 times. That doesn't necessarily apply to online learning. We've seen, for instance, you can create material and it can be used by lots of students. So for instance, open education resources, once you've created them, they're free for everyone. And if as is happening now in some of our provinces here, the provincial government creates those online resources. That's a one-off investment, but then students aren't paying textbooks. Now, the cost has shifted here. The government is picking up the cost and not the students. But nevertheless, it's a lot cheaper than the students having to buy books. So it's not a straightforward answer. What I found in running a fully online program over 7 years, you can run it at the same cost or less than a similar face-to-face course with the same kind of numbers of students. And the reason for that is you have less development, your development costs are spread over more students because you only develop the course once, create all the materials once, but your delivery costs go up according to the number of students. That's how many tutors per student, for instance. You still need to keep that a good ratio, or you don't get a lot of interaction with the instructor. So it's not a simple question to answer. But generally, the more students you have, the cheaper online learning becomes per student. There are economies of scale that you can get from online learning that you can't get from face-to-face teaching. But they're not as big as governments like to think. They think that by going online, they're going to save lots of money. That's not, you can save lots of money, but the quality goes down if you're not careful. So you have to keep a fairly good instructor-student ratio, even when you're teaching online. One of the big problems with MOOCs is that they have a very high non-completion rate because they don't give a lot of student support. And the successful students are mainly those who are already well educated. So yes, but you get a huge economies of scale because you get thousands of students taking that.
So Shruti wants to know the key things that one needs to keep in mind while devising the e-learning or the blended approach so as to, bring it all on board. And specifically, she wants to know in context of the social inclusion as seen during the pandemic.
I'm not sure I can answer that question. Three things. I think you have to understand that online students are working individually rather than in a group. And you have to think about that when you're designing your teaching. How do I keep this student engaged? How do I make sure that I'm tracking what that student is doing, that I'm following what that student is doing? And that's difficult if you've got a class of 60 or 70 students, but you have to realize that they're studying individually and not in a group. And they don't all, but of course, that's the mistake we often think in classroom teaching, that everybody's progressing at the same rate, and they're not, you just don't see it. Whereas on online, you can see that. You can see students are not participating, for instance. You can send an email and ask them why. Are they finding it too difficult, or have they got their mother's sick? But you have to be aware of those students that they're working in isolation and not as a cohort of other students all together at the same time.
Respect what Professor Tony Bates had earlier mentioned, it depends on the design. Two things I like to highlight here. Firstly, there are large number of instructional designs. I've recently reviewed all those designs, but let me tell you that design has a cultural component as well. I was recently working with a group of schools, teachers. I gave them certain assignment and I said they have to do it in a group and they are not in physical contact with each other. And so one of my experiment was how to make this individualization rather isolation, which British Open University is doing some very interesting research on how to remove the isolation. And I tried this with about 10 groups of teachers of 5 or 4, not less than 4, but not more than 5. And they are located in different locations, but they successfully completed the projects. So the whole question is, there is a design element involved in it. How are you designing the kind of learning that you are, because one of the things that you'll find in this, collaborative learning is a significant possibility in online education And that collaborative learning goes much beyond the known domain of geography. I mean, some of the things that we can see, there are many books coming out, research papers coming out. One author is in Canada, another is in England, another is in Australia, another is in India. They are collaborating. So online learning has that flexibility. The question is how we are trying to adapt it into our instructional design that we prepare. It's a limit is the imagination. There's no fixed framework, despite there are certain models which gives us a kind of structure.
Okay.
Professor Bates, any observation?
Well, I think instructionally, I think that good quality online, fully online learning has followed good instructional design principles usually. In most cases, fully online courses have someone called an instructional designer who works with the faculty member and helps them convert their course to fully online. The problem with blended learning is that basically everybody's going to be doing it. So when you only had 10% of students or courses online, it was easy to assign an instructional designer and a web designer to work with the faculty member. But if everybody's going to do blended learning, we can't scale up that level of support. So that comes back to better training of the faculty members so they know what instructional design is. We don't have to do it for them. One way to do that is to create open educational resources for instructors. So if they want to make a short video, there's a website they can go to, and there's all the instructions. University of British Columbia has a site like that, and for every piece of advice they give, there's a link to about 4 or 5 research articles that support the academic reasons for that recommendation. And that's the kind of just-in-time, on-demand kind of resources that I think instructors will need. We have to start thinking of better ways to provide the background and information that instructors need to teach well in a blended mode. And that's going to be really difficult to do if we have to have a course design, which takes 3 months before the course goes out, which is too expensive to scale up for blended learning.
From my experience, may I?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Let me take a second. This is Professor Matiul Alam.
Thank you.
Speaking from
Vancouver,
British Columbia University, Vancouver, and very close associate of Professor Tony Bates. In fact, Professor Tony Bates has been introduced to this conference by Matiul, and is a very good friend of mine. Thank you.
Thank you mentioning. What I have found about the instructional design aspect is at university level, most of the faculty members are not much aware of how to design a course. As a result, they are often dependent on instructional designers, and there is a gap between the designers and the instructors in terms of understanding the content and, of course, the learning style and all the variables impacts teaching and learning. So it is very important that the faculty development initiative needs to be in a way that some instructional design aspect will be incorporated. It's not only the course design, but how the instructor will be teaching and whether the design is flexible enough to accommodate individual differences. So these are the observations I have from last 19 years teaching online as well.
Oh, thank you so much, sir, for coming in. Thank you so much. In fact, there are so many queries and so many questions. I also wanted to know one more thing. This is with regard to the presentation of Professor Asha Kanwar, and also, learning outcomes. So when we say that more students are, like the absenteeism has lessened, students are not absenting themselves from the classes, and also that they are doing better. Because she presented a slide which did show that, the learning outcomes are better, the pass percentage has gone up. So I would like all of you to reflect, especially, Professor Bates, and sir, you also. It'll be so nice to learn from your experience. Thank you very much, sir.
I think the issue is you can teach well or badly in person or online. So the variations within a way of teaching are greater than the variations between them. If you take enough examples, you'll find no significant difference because they all cancel each other out, all the variables. What I've seen is that where the learning outcomes are compared between face-to-face and online students, they're either not significantly different, or if they are different, they're about 5 to 10% worse for online. But then when you break out the students between part-time and full-time, you find it's not so much because they're online they're doing less well, but because they're part-time students. So they don't have enough time to get their work done as well as their studying. So their work impacts on their studying. And so if you look at part-time students who are on campus, they do worse than students who are not part-time on campus. So again, you have to be very careful. There are so many factors that can lead to poor learning outcomes. And it's not just the mode of delivery.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. In fact, I just saw a question posted that how can we ensure that students, work together, like, they do it offline, coming together, and that too in the smaller classes. How do we get that activity going on? Because that is something which we are experiencing even in the teacher education programs. They have given a group assignment, but it's very difficult for them to execute in the present time. Sir, some guidelines on that?
Well, again, it comes back to the design. You can't just throw students in and expect them to do collaborative learning, either face-to-face or online, without some guidelines and some practice and some supervision. So you have to do it in steps. You can't just go from no collaboration. In fact, very often what we do is get students to compete with one another rather than to collaborate. And then suddenly we say, okay, now we're going to collaborate. And if you don't give them any guidelines about how to work together and also reward them for working together, then they're not going to do it very well, whether it's online or face-to-face. Now, there's lots of ways to get students to work collaboratively online. You can do it synchronously through breakout rooms in Zoom, for instance. You can ask students, you can divide them up into smaller groups and ask the group to do a small task, 15 minutes, then come back into the main room and present what they've done. That's very much mirroring what you would do in a classroom if you're breaking students into smaller groups to do project work. But you can also do that asynchronously online through online discussion forums, which are part of the learning management system. But again, setting up those discussion forums in such a way that the outcome that they're trying to reach is very clear, and they can't do that unless they collaborate. So it's again to do with the reward system that you give to the students for collaborating and so on. And there's a huge amount of research on collaborative learning, both in class and online. Most faculty don't know about this, but there are very clear guidelines on how to do this well. And when those guidelines are followed, it's very successful, whether it's online or in class.
Well, I think we are coming to the end of the session.
Yes, sir.
I'll request Professor Tony Bates to have little freedom to speak whatever he wants to speak without a question. His concluding remarks, because he has been bombarded with questions.
I think the big challenge is sustainable development. How do we reach that very large number of people who are not getting access to education, who are dropping out from education, and how can online and blended learning actually help students such as that? I think it's a very difficult challenge. We've seen that many students don't have access to the internet, and they tend to be poorer students or students in rural areas or students from minority groups and so on. And this is a problem not of online learning, but a problem of inequality in society. So I think that online learning can help a little bit, but it can't solve the problem on its own. There are wider social issues that need to be addressed, such as better distribution of incomes and so on, if we want to get a more equal and sustainable development.